Inflation is not a good thing. Inflation is not desirable. Higher inflation is not making progress. Right? What people want is a lower cost of living. When prices go down, that's progress. And that's capitalism. That's how capitalism works. When you have real capitalism, businesses become more productive. They become more efficient. They develop economies of scale. And as they do that, the cost of production comes down. And as the cost of production goes down, demand goes up. Because as prices go down, more people can afford to buy more stuff. And it's falling prices that have historically driven a rising standard of living. Well, the government has interrupted that benevolent process through inflation. And a lot of the times, inflation doesn't simply make prices go up. Inflation also prevents prices from going down. And a decline in a price would have been a windfall for the consumer. When the consumer is denied that windfall by government, it's still a tax. The government is still taking your purchasing power because the goods and services that you want to consume are more expensive as a result of the government inflation. Now, of course, a lot of the inflation that government has been creating since the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of that inflation has temporarily moved into asset prices. That's the stock market, the bond market, the real estate market, the market for collectibles or other things that are in short supply. When inflation pushes up asset prices, people don't complain because the people that own those assets, of course, feel much richer. Now, if you don't own those assets, obviously it's problematic if you want to buy it. For example, if housing prices keep going up and you don't own a house, and you want to buy one, the fact that prices keep going up, that's not a good thing. Now, the way the government has offset that is by keeping interest rates artificially low so that people can afford to overpay for houses as the prices keep going up. But again, all of that helps distort the economy and fuel the bubble. But beneath the surface, consumer prices have been rising. For all this talk about deflation, we haven't had any. For all the talk about an inadequate increase in the CPI, consumer prices have been going up despite the government's best effort to hide that through the CPI. I mean, if you think the CPI is giving you an accurate read on inflation, that'd be like assuming the mafia is going to give you an accurate report on crime. I mean, clearly, if you hired the mafia to study crime, you wouldn't be surprised to find that they said that there wasn't any, and therefore there's no need for more police because there's no crime. The last thing the government wants is for the public to realize how much inflation there is. They certainly don't want bond investors to realize that. The key to sustaining the bubble economy, the key to sustaining massive and unsustainable government deficits in the short run is artificially low interest rates. And the Fed's only justification for keeping interest rates artificially low is the preposterous idea that there's not enough inflation. And therefore, they need to keep rates low in order to make consumer prices higher. But again, it's absurd to believe that consumers want higher prices. If they really did, then stores would advertise price hikes instead of price cuts. They wouldn't make a big deal about having a sale. They would send out notices, hey, hurry up and buy, we just raised our prices. Consumers don't enjoy increased prices. They look forward to decreased prices. So this is all a ruse because the government is trying to justify a reckless monetary policy that is designed to protect the government, not the economy or not the people. But we're about to suffer the consequences of all this inflation in a way that's far greater than what I even imagined when I first began coming to these money shows. And a lot of that, too, has to do with what's happened during the pandemic, which is obviously not an event that I had built into my forecast, but nonetheless is simply accelerating everything that I have been forecasting and will make it worse. Because a lot of people, their initial response to the pandemic was, oh, this is deflationary, right? This means people are not going to have demand for things because they're staying at home. Well, that's true. A lot of people stayed at home, and so they didn't buy as much, airline tickets or stay in hotels, but they had no problem shopping on Amazon. And so it wasn't that demand stopped during the pandemic. It just transferred money that consumers weren't spending traveling. They simply spent it on other things. And a lot of people, unfortunately, because of our politicians, a lot of people ended up with more money being unemployed than they had when they actually had jobs. And that was because the government's unemployment benefits were so generous. You had people earning double, and in some cases triple, not working than what they earned when they actually had jobs. And so a lot of this money was spent. In addition, you had a lot of people who were told, hey, you don't have to pay your rent. You're not going to get evicted. So you had a lot of people that didn't spend money on rent, but now had extra money to buy other things. So there was a lot of spending going on during the pandemic. And a lot of that spending was on imports. That's why our trade deficit in goods is at an all-time record high. We are importing more goods than ever before. Our total trade deficit, when you count our surplus in services, is the highest it's been since 2008, just before the financial crisis. And I think within the next couple of months, we are going to break that record, which means, despite what Donald Trump promised as a candidate, the trade deficit is much worse as his presidency is coming to an end than it was when he inherited the economy from Obama. And in fact, the trade deficits were getting bigger even before the pandemic. They just accelerated faster after it, given the bubble nature of our economy and the fact that our manufacturing sector had continued to deteriorate on Trump's watch. And of course, it's going to get even worse now that Biden's there. And of course, it's both deficits. The budget deficits have exploded beyond anything. In fact, we don't have the final numbers yet, but I think it's possible that Donald Trump may have added more debt in 4 years than Obama did in 8. And if you recall, President Obama added more debt during his 8 years than all the presidents before him, from George Washington to George Bush. And then Obama comes in and adds as much. And now Trump has done that in half the time. And now we're heading into the Biden administration. So again, the point I'm making here is that the pandemic increased this demand, but also decreased supply. What happened during the pandemic and what is still happening? People didn't go to work. Factories shut down. Supply chains got bogged down because there was nothing being supplied. So as demand was coming up, supply was going down. Governments around the world are printing all this money as factories are shutting down, as mines are shutting down. So we're getting less production of stuff, but we're getting a lot more production of money. Meanwhile, companies took on unprecedented amounts of debt. Governments took on unprecedented amounts of debt to do the wrong thing. What should governments have done during the pandemic? They should have cut government spending. They should have recognized that the economy was in trouble, and the way that you help an economy is by reducing the burden that government places on that economy. Government exacts a cost because government produces nothing. Government lives off the productivity of the private sector. Well, if the private sector is thriving, then the government can take some of those resources. But when the private sector is struggling with pressures like the pandemic, government needs to be smaller. Government needs to cut back and free up those resources back to the private sector so it can use them when it needs them. Instead, we did the opposite. We compounded the problems by increasing the toll exacted by government. And so we have more debt than ever before, more money creation than ever before, and we have created an economy that is more dependent on debt and money printing than ever before. That is why inflation is about to go through the roof.